Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Good evening to everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you as well to Open Media and rabble.ca for sponsoring the event, and thanks as well to my very enthusiastic longtime reader, Bill Owen, for organizing such a great event and for helping me be able to come this week to Canada, where I have had a very eventful 96 hours. It is actually, in an interesting way, I feel like I've had, despite how tumultuous it's been, a rather productive week, because I feel like I've accomplished something on my list of life objectives that a lot of people who believe the stereotypes about your country would say that would be impossible to achieve, which is I have gotten to spend the entire week with my email inbox full of enraged Canadians. And there are a lot of people who would have said that that's just impossible to achieve, so it's something I get to check off of my list. The reaction to the article I wrote this week, which I wrote after the Quebec attack, but very shortly before news of the Ottawa shooting broke, actually did provoke among the most intense and polarizing reaction of anything that I've ever written. And in a lot of ways, I look at that as a sign that it was actually a piece very worth writing. Because I do think ultimately the role of journalism, especially at the most difficult times, is to question and challenge the assumptions that people cling to most fervently. And I heard from at least as many Canadians, who were supportive of the arguments I had made and who were appreciative of the fact that the debate ended up including those arguments and perspectives as I did hearing from enraged Canadians. And I think this really underscores an important point, which is that the events of this week, as tragic and horrific as they have been to watch unfold, really do provide the perfect framework in a lot of ways to think about all of the issues that I had long planned here to come and discuss. Those issues are ones that I've been working on for many years, but were really brought into vivid highlight by the work I've been able to do over the last 16 months reporting on the extraordinary archive of documents provided to me by my heroic source, Edward Snowden. And these issues pertain to the messages and narratives that Western democracies, the governments of Western democracies, have been disseminating to their citizenry in the post-9/11 era about terrorism, about threats, about the nature of our societies, and they pertain to all of the policies that have been ushered in as a result of those claims. And in a lot of ways, the events of this week, which I've gotten to see unfold firsthand by being here, are almost like a perfect laboratory for understanding how countries in the West have responded to these kinds of attacks and the policies and perspectives that they've been able to entrench as a result. The very first event that happened upon the first attack that I immediately noticed and recognized as extremely familiar and significant was the instantaneous injection, and by instantaneous, I do mean instantaneous, injection of the most inflammatory, but also the most meaningless word in our political lexicon, which is terrorism. Almost instantly, before anybody knew anything about the perpetrators of either events, the media and political class in this country, and then in the United States and throughout the West, all agreed by consensus that both of these attacks were adequately and even necessarily described as being terrorism. There was no discussion, as usual, of what that word means or what an act has to do in order to qualify. It was simply a label that instantly got applied almost reflexively, without any reflection or deliberation or discussion of any kind. And that word, as I said, is meaningless in the sense that it has no definition, but it's inflammatory in the sense that it's incredibly consequential, and it happens over and over again with these attacks, and I think it's really worth thinking about what that word means and the effect that we've allowed it to have on all of our thought processes as citizens. That was followed by the remarkable agility of how the Harper government tactically responded to these attacks. I am not a particularly enthused fan of the Harper government, but you know, I think it's important to give credit where it's due. The speed and the aggression and the brazenness and the shamelessness with which the Prime Minister moved to manipulate and exploit the emotions around these events to demand more powers for himself was, in a really warped way, almost impressive. I mean, I think you've got to give him credit. If you look at how other Western governments have responded to these attacks, they usually have the decency to wait an interval of 2 to 3 weeks before admitting that they're exploiting these fears in order to justify new legislation and new powers. But Prime Minister Harper is remarkably unburdened by those kind of qualms. It's amazing. I mean, less than 48 hours after the Ottawa shootings, he stood up in the House of Commons. This was yesterday, and this is what he said. He said, quote, "Our laws and police powers need to be strengthened in the areas of surveillance, detention, and arrest. They need to be much strengthened. I assure members that work which is already underway will be expedited." And again, the only thing unusual about that is the speed and nakedness with which it has happened, but this has been the process in the 9/11 era, where these attacks are instantly seized upon as a way to further dismantle core protections of civil liberties and core principles of Western justice. Another really visible and really familiar dynamic that I was able to see this week is what I often refer to as the too soon tactic. I had a lot of people who wrote to me, the Canadians who wrote to me, who said, look, I agree with a lot of what you've said in that article and what you've been saying in interviews throughout this week. I think it's important for you to say it, but I just feel like it's too soon. I don't know, apparently there's some kind of like time limit that you're supposed to wait before you start talking about these attacks in a substantive way. And while I understand the sentiment behind that claim, the problem with it is that there is no such thing as too soon when it comes to how the government and their allies in the media start politicizing these events. It was, as I said, instantaneous that it got labeled a terrorist attack, and that there were all kinds of claims, very debatable claims made based on the emotions that came out of these attacks. And I think if you're a journalist or a citizen, it's actually irresponsible to see these critical hours when citizenry is most engaged in an emotional and very riveted way, thinking about these issues, to cede that to the government and let the government messages go unchallenged. They don't wait before they start politicizing, not just the event, but even these well-intentioned emotional rituals that spring up around them. And I think it's worth talking about that as well. But the most significant part of this dynamic that I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about is the way in which we have been persuaded to think about the world in a drastically different way than reality ought to suggest. And by that I mean that we have been persuaded to think about our own societies and our own governments and our own behavior in the world that bears very little resemblance to the reality of what we've allowed our society and governments to do in the world. And to illustrate that as best as I can, I just want to share with you a little anecdote that involves Canada. The very first story from the Snowden archive that I was able to report that specifically involved Canada, I mean, all the stories involve Canada in the sense that they're all about the internet and we all share the same internet, but the very first story that I was able to report about surveillance from the Snowden archive that pertained to Canada was back in October of last year. And I reported this story with the large Brazilian television network Globo. And what this story revealed, it used documents from your version of the NSA, which is CSEC, the surveillance agency in Canada. And what it revealed was that CSEC had been spying on the communications of the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy, which, oh so coincidentally, just happens to be the agency in Brazil of greatest interest to the Canadian timber and logging industry. And when I reported this story, before I reported it, I knew it was going to be a huge story in Brazil. in part because they're very concerned about the way in which surveillance is being used to essentially cheat in the economic marketplace to gain unfair economic advantage. Also because it smacks of the kind of colonialism and imperialism with which that country has been plagued for so long by its neighbors to the north. But also I knew that while it would be a huge story in Brazil, I didn't actually expect it to be a very big story in Canada. And the reason I didn't think it would be a big story in Canada is because from experience, I know that when I've done reporting along the lines of country A is spying on country B, the country being spied on, cares a huge amount. But typically country A, the country doing the spying, doesn't really care at all. People care about the stories that show that they're being spied on. They don't care very much about stories showing their government is spying on other people around the world. And yet my expectations were completely thwarted once we did the reporting. It was a huge story in Canada. It led the nightly news, I think, 4 or 5 consecutive nights. I was deluged with requests from Canadian journalists to do interviews and to help them do further reporting. A lot of them did further reporting, and I was surprised, very surprised, at how much that story resonated here in Canada. And I spoke to a couple of Canadian journalists who I know pretty well. In fact, I spoke with 3 or 4 of them, and I asked them, why has this story become so big in Canada? This idea that Canada is spying on this ministry in Brazil. And they said, well, basically there are 2 reasons why this story ended up being so big. They said, number 1, there were a ton of Canadians, probably most, who didn't even know there was such an agency called CSEC. That Canadians just didn't know that they had an agency engaged in this very far-reaching and invasive electronic surveillance. They were watching the Snowden reporting. They knew the NSA did it. They knew the British had the GCHQ. But a lot of Canadians just did not know that there was an agency called CSEC engaging in this kind of activity. And then secondly, they said, and I found this even more meaningful, they said, the self-perception that Canadians have nationalistically is completely at odds with what this story revealed. Essentially, they were saying, the idea is that Canadians think, we're Canadians. We don't do that kind of thing. We don't spy on democratically elected friendly governments for unfair economic advantage. And I found both of those points to be profoundly significant. I mean, if you think about the first point, the idea that there's this agency called CSEC that throughout the world engages in incredibly consequential behavior, which the very existence of which has been kept from Canadians, let alone the broad strokes of what they do. Think about what that means for the claim that we're living in a meaningful democracy. Whenever people ask me, and I get asked this all the time in interviews, what is the most meaningful revelation that you discovered from the Snowden archive? What I always say is obviously the threat to privacy posed by this surveillance, the vast amount of communications they collect every day is very significant. But even more significant than that is the threat posed to democracy. It is stunning that these 5 governments of the Five Eyes Alliance, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, have instituted a system as self-evidently consequential with such profound, far-reaching implications as a system of mass surveillance without a whiff of disclosure or debate among the citizenries that are supposed to hold them democratically accountable. I did a story, I think, about 4 months ago, that came from the NSA archive. That was one of the most significant ones I think we did, even though it didn't get a lot of attention compared to the other stories. And the story was essentially about this magazine that the NSA publishes internally. They have like a magazine that's top secret. It's only for themselves, and it looks like every other magazine that you would buy at a newsstand, except it's really creepy. They constantly boast of all the wonderful ways they've invaded other people's communications, and they have little profiles of the technological nerds who have figured out how to break into somebody's email account, and they highlight them, and it's like Snoop of the Week, that kind of thing. And one of the issues that we had in the Snowden archive contained an interview. They do interviews just like every other magazine, and the interview was with the top official at the NSA in charge of foreign partnerships. He manages the NSA's relationship with the GCHQ and CSEC here in Canada and European countries and every other agency with which the NSA cooperates, and the interviewer asked him this question. The interviewer said, there's this incredibly strange phenomenon that a lot of us can't figure out, which is in all of these other countries with which we partner, you have wild swings in the outcome of political elections. Sometimes conservatives win, other times liberals win. You have the far right that can govern, you have the far left, and it almost makes no difference, the interviewer said. Nothing ever changes. Our partnerships with these other countries continues as strong no matter who wins or loses the election. Why is that? And one of the really fascinating things and unusual things about reading these documents from the Snowden archive is that you encounter this thing you never otherwise see, which is government officials who, when they're asked a question, actually tell the truth because they didn't ever think that anybody would know what their answer was because it was all supposed to be secret. And what this official said in response to that question to me was incredibly significant. He said, the reason these partnerships never change based on the outcome of elections is because there is almost nobody outside of the military structure of these countries that even knows that these partnerships exist. In other words, the people that we go to the polls and elect as our political leaders have no idea and never learn about the existence of these surveillance activities, and therefore can't change them because they don't know about them. And over in all of the countries in which I did reporting over the last 16 months, I constantly had top officials or members of parliament or Congress say to me, I was responsible for overseeing this agency, and yet I learned so much more from reading your articles that were published than I ever learned from the oversight committees on which I sat, or from the government meetings I attend. It really is, we've allowed there to be, it's almost like a state within a state. And the state that is within the state is one that has been completely removed from democratic accountability or from transparency of any kind. And that experience in writing about CSEC for the first time and the way in which it resonated here really underscored that for me. Think of how little we have learned prior to that reporting about the most, or one of the most, profoundly consequential programs that our government has implemented, and think about how genuine of a democracy we really have, how meaningful it really is if we go to the polls and pick the leader that we want if we have no idea what it is that they're doing. And of course, it's not just surveillance, but all sorts of other policies implemented in the name of terrorism that have existed beyond this wall of secrecy. And the implications for democracy are incredibly profound, as is our ability as citizens to understand what our government is doing. Now that leads to the other reason that they gave that I found even more fascinating, which was, although they were saying it half in jest, it was really actually quite true, this idea that, well, Canadians reacted to the story because it's inconsistent with their self-perception. We're Canadians, we don't do this sort of thing. Obviously, that perception was wrong. Canadians do that sort of thing. The documents we published demonstrate that they did exactly that. And when you think about what that means, that the reality of what our government is doing, on the one hand, is inconsistent with the perceptions that we have about our government on the other, that's another way of saying that the citizenry has been propagandized. That is the definition of that term, that they have been led to believe pleasant things about their government that actually is disparate to the reality of what the government does in the world. And this, to me, is the crux of the entire post-9/11 era and of the events that we saw this week. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that a little bit more in depth. I remember really vividly the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attack. I'm talking about like the days and weeks after the 9/11 attack. I was in Manhattan on 9/11. I had lived and worked there for 10 years, and so I recalled that experience and still recall it very, very clearly. And the prevailing emotion that was triggered by the 9/11 attacks in the immediate aftermath, not months down the road once the government began massaging the messaging, but the immediate aftermath was not one of anger or vengeance or sadness. It wasn't those things. The immediate prevailing emotion was bafflement, shock, and surprise. And the question that was on almost everybody's mind is, why would somebody possibly want to do this to the United States? Why would somebody have such hatred for Americans that they would be willing to blow themselves up in order to kill as many people indiscriminately whom they don't know? What kind of causes could have led them to that state, that mindset? And this was being asked not rhetorically. It wasn't a protestation of innocence or anything else like that. It was a genuine question. Most Americans genuinely did not understand the answer. And the US government knew that it had to provide an answer because everybody knew there was some reason. Everyone knew it wasn't random. The group that was responsible for it didn't put the names of all the countries into a hat and happened to pick out the United States. There had to be some reason, and the government knew it had to provide an explanation. And the explanation that it ended up providing was one that we now, 12 years later, can scoff at pretty readily, but at the time it's what huge numbers of Americans believed because their government told them that and the media told them that. And the answer was, the reason they hate us isn't because of anything we've done. Perish the thought. It has nothing to do with anything that we've done. The reason they hate us is because we're so free that they hate us for our freedoms. That was the genuine answer with a straight face that the US government and then the US media delivered to the American population. And what was so extraordinary about that, if you look back on it, is that it was not difficult at all to find out the reason. There was a long list of grievances that not only the group that perpetrated the attack, but a huge part of the Muslim world had been openly discussing for many, many years. You could have gone and read Muslim newspapers, you could have visited Muslim countries, you could have talked to somebody who was Muslim, you could have sought out any of that dialogue. And the grievances were all very clear, and they were all embedded into the culture for a long time. It wasn't just things like the US putting troops on what is perceived as holy soil in Saudi Arabia. It was much more substantial, things like imposing a sanctions regime on Iraq that killed several 100,000 Iraqi children, or overthrowing their democratically elected leaders and propping up the most heinous despots and tyrants, such as the ones that ruled Egypt and that still rule Saudi Arabia, or steadfastly supporting militarily, economically, and diplomatically the country of Israel as it engages in all sorts of violence against its neighbors in Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. This list of grievances was fully aired in that part of the world, and yet, remarkably, Americans didn't just reject the validity of those grievances. They didn't reach the conclusion that it didn't justify the attacks. They literally were completely unaware of the existence of that dialogue from that part of the world. They had no idea that their government was even doing these things. And that is stunning. The fact that for so long, critical parts of what the US government were doing in the world were simply suppressed in most US discourse, to the point where Americans literally did not even know the existence of it. If you look at polling data and other surveys of the Muslim world versus the Western world, and by the Muslim world I simply mean shorthand for predominantly Muslim countries, you find radical differences in how people in that part of the world think about things versus how people in our part of the world think about things. And we often like to tell ourselves that the reason for this disparate view is because they don't have a free press, and they're primitive, and they get misled, and they're propagandized. And there's all kinds of polling data that shows that if you ask people in that part of the world, as polling agencies has done, which countries are the greatest threat to world peace, people in that part of the world don't say Iran and China and Russia and North Korea. Overwhelmingly, they say the greatest threats to world peace are two countries, two close allies of Canada, which is the United States, and Israel. And so it may be true in some cases that sometimes what explains this disparate perspective in the world is that that part of the world is propagandized, but sometimes what explains it is that we are. And I think it's critical to accept that fact and to confront it. Nobody likes to think of themselves as living in a society that's propagandized. I think the most vivid example demonstrating how this works, that is a seemingly narrow one, but to me very powerful one, is one that happened in 2009. In 2009, this woman who is an Iranian-American journalist named Roxana Saberi was detained while in Iran doing journalism work. And the Iranian government said that they had detained her and then arrested her because they suspected that she was a spy. And she was imprisoned in an Iranian prison for 3 months until an Iranian court ordered her released on the grounds that there was no evidence to justify her detention. And during that 3 months, when she was imprisoned in an Iranian prison, her cause, her case, was one of the most celebrated cases in American media circles. Almost every prominent journalist would go on Twitter every day and say, "Free Roxana." They would report on it at night. They would demand it. There was all this outrage over the idea that, look at Iran. They're a country that's so tyrannical, they actually imprison journalists. And there was indignation and horror over what they had done. And the same thing happened a few months later when North Korea imprisoned for a short period of time 2 American Korean journalists and then ended up releasing them when Al Gore went in and visited. Huge amounts of attention paid, huge amounts of anger and indignation that a country could be so tyrannical as to imprison journalists. At the same exact time that all of that was happening, the United States government had been imprisoning over 24 journalists as part of what it calls the War on Terror, including the case of somebody named Sami al-Haq. Sami al-Haq was an Al Jazeera photojournalist and cameraman who was arrested and detained by the US government when he was crossing into the border of Afghanistan to cover the war for Al Jazeera in late 2001. And he was taken first to Bagram, the prison in Bagram in Afghanistan, and then shortly after he was taken to Guantanamo, where he remained for the next 6 years without being charged with any kind of a crime, given no due process of any kind, where he was interrogated overwhelmingly about his work for Al Jazeera and almost none about anything to do with terrorism or Al-Qaeda. The reason that's so amazing is because the words Sami al-Haq were almost never mentioned in American political discourse. To this day, Americans have no idea that their government imprisoned 24 journalists as part of the War on Terror, or kept an Al Jazeera photojournalist imprisoned in Guantanamo for 6 years without any kind of trial. In fact, I once did a Nexus search where I looked up the word Roxana Saberi and found the number of mentions during that 3-month period, just 3 months, when she was detained in an Iranian prison, and it was something like 8,000 mentions in American media accounts of her name. If you search the name Sami al-Haq for the 7 years that he was kept in Guantanamo, it is less than 100. I think the number is something like 71. Americans have no idea who he is. In the Muslim world, however, Sami al-Haq is a huge celebrity. When he was released, it was major headline news all over that part of the world. People in that part of the world know that it isn't just Iran and North Korea, which imprisons journalists, but also the United States that does so. It's we in this part of the world from whom that has been largely kept. And this disparity between what our government is doing in the world and what we actually ourselves are aware of, I think is central to so much of what has gone wrong in the post-9/11 era. And all of this was the backdrop for what I watched this week in Canada. And what prompted me, it was the main impetus for me to write the article that I wrote. And I remember the moment that I decided that I had to write about this. I was reading a newspaper account of the attack in Quebec, and I was simultaneously watching a Canadian television program about it. And the theme of both the article and the television show was the same. The theme was this. It was, people are stunned that this kind of violence could take place in such a peaceful community like the one where it took place. And I remember thinking that on some level that's really appealing to believe that that's true. It is, of course, true that the community where that attack occurred is relatively peaceful. And if you walk around Canada, as I've done many, many times over the past 5 or 6 years in many cities, it seems like a really peaceful country. It is a really peaceful country when you walk on Canadian soil. All of that is really true. But what isn't true is that the foreign policy of Canada is peaceful. The foreign policy of Canada is not peaceful. And I say that not judgmentally or in denunciation. I'll get to that in a minute. For the moment, I say that only as a literal observation of fact. I think a lot of times I've seen Americans who come and speak to the Canadians like to kind of play up these stereotypes and flatter Canadians by saying our government is really militaristic and warlike, especially under the Bush administration, and we so wish we could be more like you, this kind of nice, tranquil, diverse, peaceful country, and there is an extent to which that's not entirely mythical. Just from the Obama administration alone, in the last 6 years under President Obama, this to me is one of the most extraordinary statistics that I've heard. In the last 6 years, just under President Obama, who, by the way, won the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize, the United States has dropped bombs on seven different predominantly Muslim countries. Syria is now the 7th, in addition to a Muslim minority in the Philippines, which is really 8 countries that have been bombed just since the inauguration of the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize winner. Now, Canada has not been a party to all of that. Canada often refrains from some American aggression, most notably and commendably, largely though not entirely refraining from participating in the war in Iraq. But Canada is a steadfast ally and partner of the United States in all kinds of militarism and violence. Years of invasion and occupation in Afghanistan, a bombing campaign of Libya that left that country in utter and complete shambles, and now what the Canadian press itself is calling a new war in Iraq, which has already spilled over into Syria. Now, you may have a lot of different views about all of those policies. You may believe that those policies are charitable acts of nation-building generosity. And maybe they are. That's a debate that people can have and have had. But there is a huge part of the world, hundreds of millions of people, that regard those wars much, much differently. They see them as acts of aggression and militarism. They see the innocent children and the women and the innocent men who are killed continuously by those policies, on top of which the participation of Canada in things like surveillance or rendition, literally picking up people from around the world, including in one case your own citizen, and sending them to the world's worst regimes to be tortured. You cannot be a country that lets your government engage in militarism and violence and that kind of radicalism and aggression in multiple countries around the world year after year after year, and simultaneously have the expectation that there will never be any violence brought back to the country perpetrating that. And this is not some radical left-wing doctrine that I invented. This concept of what is called blowback has been CIA doctrine for many decades. The idea that if a government engages in military action in a different country, in a different sovereign country, maybe it's not justifiable, but it is inevitable that violence will be brought back to that country. There is this remarkable 2004 report that was commissioned by the George Bush Pentagon, run by Donald Rumsfeld. And it was given to the Defense Task Force. And the question that Donald Rumsfeld commissioned that task force to ask was, what is ultimately the cause of terrorism? Why are there so many people in the world that want to do violence to the United States? And you can go online and read it. It seemed as though what I wrote this week or what I said in interviews was somehow controversial. It isn't. It is self-evident. The report in 2004 concluded this. This is what it said. It said, the key cause of terrorism aimed at Americans is, quote, American direct intervention in the Muslim world. American direct intervention in the Muslim world. It then identified 3 different policies that comprise this direct intervention. One is support for the region's worst tyrants, giving economic aid and drowning in weapons the regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Secondly was steadfast support for Israel, which is viewed as enabling all sorts of aggression in that part of the world. And third was actual wars and occupations, principally the invasion of Afghanistan. Canada plays a role in all of those policies. And what the report concluded, and this is not me saying this, this is an actual quote, it repudiated the US government's statements to its own citizenry in the wake of 9/11 about why the 9/11 attack happened, why terrorism happens. This is what it concluded, quote, Muslims do not, quote, hate our freedoms, end quote, but rather they hate our policies. It is so tempting to see ourselves as victims, as pure and innocent victims. It is. We all want to see ourselves that way. We get to emancipate ourselves from any kind of responsibility or culpability or guilt. It's really tempting to say, when our societies are attacked rather than our societies doing the attacking, that the reason it happens is because there's this extremist religion in the world, or an extremist version of a religion that's just unbearably hateful and irrationally savage, and they just want to do violence for its own sake. They hate us for our freedoms. That just simply isn't the case. And I think it is our responsibility as citizens, and certainly as journalists, to make certain that the dialogue isn't comfortable or flattering. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to make it as rational and fact-based as possible so that we're not actually susceptible to manipulation. So I just want to talk about one other point about the events of this week and how critical I think it is in this dynamic. And this is actually a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, but again, I think it's probably a sign that it's really worth talking about. I have spent, I think, 3 or 4 days now, like everybody else in this country, watching unbelievably difficult to watch footage of the family members of the 2 soldiers who were killed, one in each of the attacks. And I've learned their names, and I've learned what their life aspirations were. I've seen their parents grieving on the screen, or their siblings. It is incredibly horrific and emotional and tragic to watch, and I've gone through that exact same thing with all other Canadians. But the thing that I find very significant about that, and we should be focused on the victims that way, but what I find really significant about that is that over the past 12 years, my government especially, but also yours, has done all kinds of things that has resulted in the horrific deaths of innocent people throughout the world. Thousands of children, women, and innocent men. And I would be willing to bet almost anything that over 99.9% of Americans and 99.9% of Canadians are completely incapable of identifying the name of a single one of those victims. We know nothing about the life aspirations of the people that our government, whose lives they end. We don't hear from their grieving mothers or their grieving siblings. They are literally disappeared from our public discourse. And in some sense, this is just natural human behavior. We care more and pay more attention when our neighbor down the street, whom we know really well, gets killed in a car accident than we do if someone thousands of miles away who we don't know is killed. That's just, in some sense, natural human interaction with the world. But when it comes to public policy, it's a really dangerous thing to have that kind of a one-sided perspective on the world. That is what then leads us to believe that there is this ideology out there that's evil and savage and kills innocent people in the most horrific and tragic ways, and we are nothing more than the innocent victims who are the bystanders of it because we allow ourselves to suppress the implications of our own actions and the things that cause it. So I think the reason that, for me, it's so important to talk about these things is twofold. One is that I think we become much more susceptible to the kind of fear-mongering that the Canadian government is already engaged in, that Western governments uniformly engage in, to manipulate our emotions, to get us to acquiesce to things like what Prime Minister Harper calls greater police powers of surveillance, detention, and arrest. There's even talk that the Conservatives in Parliament want to introduce a bill to criminalize anything that is perceived as endorsing or legitimizing terrorist attacks, something that was particularly alarming for me because although I didn't actually say it, a lot of people falsely claim that I did, that I was justifying and legitimizing the attack by talking about the things I'm talking about tonight. That's pretty extreme and pretty radical. We become more susceptible to that kind of manipulation when we don't face the reality of what our own governments do. But the more important reason to confront these facts, I believe, is because it's really easy to look back at past generations and to make judgments and condemnations about what they did and the reasons why they made all kinds of evil choices and to have clarity about the path that they embarked on. And it's extremely difficult to do that to ourselves. But I think it's worth trying to imagine what the next generation or future generations will think about what it is that we're doing. And I think it is undoubtedly true, uncontrovertibly the case, that future generations will look back, certainly at the United States, but also its key allies, and say that in the wake of 9/11, the US and its allies embarked upon a path of endless war. They put themselves in a mindset and in a policy approach that guaranteed not a long war, but a war that had no end. And the reason I say that is because the pattern of what has happened is so clear over 13 years and so clear this week, which is we do something in that part of the world that generates all sorts of rage and fury, rightly or wrongly. That rage and fury causes a tiny percentage of people in that world to want to bring violence back to us. When violence is brought back to us, we immediately demand that our government further erode civil liberties and engage in even more militarism, which in turn inflames that part of the world more and causes more violence to be brought back to us in a never-ending spiral. How do people think we're ever going to be able to get off that path if each time one of these attacks happens, our reaction is the same? And I think there's just two critical points we're thinking about in terms of that process. One is that the mere existence of a successful attack is not evidence that government policy was flawed. The mere existence of a terrorist attack doesn't show that the government should change its policy. You could have the most perfect government policy, the perfect calibration of privacy and security, or freedom and security, and still have terrorist attacks. You cannot have a society in which absolute safety is the goal. It isn't achievable, and trying to achieve it will create so many worse harms than the failure to have it in the first place. We allow that all the time. When we see a fatal car accident, we don't start immediately demanding that our government lower the speed limit or change its policies. We accept that in exchange for the benefits of having automobiles, we're going to have the risk of death, and sometimes people are going to die. It's intrinsic to the process. It's unavoidable, and it can't be solved. We don't demand that the speed limit be reduced to 3 miles per hour in order to avoid fatalities. We should be thinking the same way about terrorism. This is the crucial fact. Even after this week, and even if there are weeks and weeks more of weeks like this one in the year ahead or the 2 years ahead, if you are a Canadian citizen, if you're Canadian, you have a greater chance of dying by slipping in the bathtub and hitting your head on the cement or getting struck by lightning than you do dying in a terrorist attack. That's just factually the case. And yet we've allowed this word terrorism to take on such profound meaning that right before our eyes, governments dismantle the core protections, the defining attributes of Western justice in order to keep us safe from it. And I think it's critically important not to reflexively act that way every time there's an attack. But the last point I just want to leave you with is this word terrorism itself. Because in all the things that I've written about over the last 10 years, every single issue, from torture to indefinite detention, to killing people whose names you don't even know with drones, to massive government secrecy, to all kinds of pervasive mass surveillance, the government and its defenders use one word over and over to justify everything that they do, and that is the word terrorism. They just utter the word and expect, often reasonably, that it will end the debate in their favor. It is the most consequential word in our political vocabulary. And what's really amazing about that fact is it is simultaneously a word that does not have any fixed meaning. You cannot provide any definition of terrorism that will then lead to a consistent application. You cannot find scholars who can give you what that definition of that word means. There's a famous Supreme Court case in the United States where the Supreme Court justices grappled over the word obscenity, because pornography in the United States is legal, but obscenity isn't. And the Supreme Court justices had to define obscenity. When does something cross the line from pornography to obscenity? And this Supreme Court justice very famously said, well, all I can say about obscenity is I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. which is a really kind of alarming way for our First Amendment freedoms to be defined, based on this kind of tingly sensation in your stomach about what this phenomenon is. That is the same way that terrorism is talked about. I mean, it was remarkable, the incident in Quebec, according to the government's own version of events, the perpetrator of that crime waited for 2 hours in his car in order to find a soldier in uniform and attack that soldier. Now, whatever terrorism means, and it's impossible to define, but the one common usage that it typically has is it requires the deliberate targeting of civilians with violence for political ends. And yet here is somebody who seemed to have deliberately avoided targeted civilians and targeted a soldier instead. Clearly illegal and unjustified. This was not a soldier deployed in war. But how, in what sense is that terrorism? Or if you have somebody like the Ottawa shooter, who very likely, although we don't know, seems to be driven at least by mental instability as much as religion or ideology, in what sense, if that turns out to be the case, is that terrorism? I think what this really shows is that the word terrorism, as significant as it's become, really has no meaning other than violence engaged in by Muslims against the West. It's really just a term to legitimize the kind of violence that we do ourselves and to delegitimize the violence that is used against us. And when you think about it in that way, it should have far different consequences than it has now when it comes to be applied without anybody really thinking about it, what it is. So the last point I just want to leave you with fully, and then I'll talk to Jesse, is not quite about the events of this week directly. It's actually about the last year and a half of work that I've been able to do with Edward Snowden. And I just want to share with you one particular lesson that I learned from the last year and a half that I try and impart to everybody wherever I go and whatever I'm speaking about, because to me it was a really profound lesson. It's something that'll influence me for the rest of my life. When I first talked to Edward Snowden, the very first conversation that I ever had with him was online, and I knew nothing about him. I didn't know his name, I didn't know how old he was, I didn't even know in which agency he worked. But what I did know was that he had claimed to have an enormous amount of extremely sensitive material from the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful government, and that he wanted to give that to me. And usually when you have somebody who comes forward, even with a tiny fraction of what he had, to give you information that the law says they're not allowed to give you, they want to hide, they want to be protected, they want to remain anonymous because they fear the consequences of being discovered. Edward Snowden said exactly the opposite thing to me. He said, I don't want to hide. I don't intend to hide. I intend, once I give you this material, to come forward into the world and publicly identify myself as the source, and to explain to the world why it is that I did what I did, and to explain my reasoning and motives of why I think it's the right thing to do. He said, I do think it's the right thing to do, and therefore I don't feel a need to hide. And when I got to Hong Kong, I remember before I got there, I had this mental image of what he's like. I'm sure you've all had that experience. When you interact with somebody only on the internet, you develop a mental image, and it's never, ever anything like what they're like when you finally meet them. I thought he was in his 60s or 70s. I get to Hong Kong, and there's this kid. You know, he's 29, he looks 6 years younger. He looks like sort of any kind of a computer geek that wanders the mall or is in a college laboratory. And I spent a lot of time with him trying to understand his motives for why he would want to unravel his life and come forward, knowing that it would probably mean that he would go to prison for the rest of his life. And what I finally understood about those motives was that he had discovered something that he believed was a profound injustice, and knew that he had the ability to do something about it. And what he said to me was, if I confront this injustice and know that I can do something about it and decide not to, that will produce severe pain. I will have to live with that on my conscience for the rest of my life, and the pain of having to do that is so much worse, he said, than anything the US government could do to him, including putting him into prison for decades. And the reason why that is so stunning to me and why it has so profoundly affected how I look at pretty much everything is because Edward Snowden is the most ordinary and unremarkable person you will ever meet. He came from a lower middle class background. His father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He grew up without a shred of position or power or prestige. And even once he decided to do what he did, he was just toiling away in obscurity in this massive national security corporation. And yet, through nothing more than an act of conscience and a fearless commitment to the political principles that he said he believed in, he changed the world. He did. He literally changed the world. He transformed how hundreds of millions of people around the world think about a vast array of issues. He radically altered the debate about who we are and what kinds of rights we have in the digital age and the relationship of individuals to the state and to states to one another and the role of journalism in society. All kinds of implications, some of which we know, most of which we probably don't. And one of the things that I have encountered from the first moment that I began writing about politics 10 years ago, not just in other people but myself, is this kind of temptation of defeatism. Like, it's very easy to look at all these policies and all these complexities and to say to yourself, the institutions that are responsible are so enormous and so powerful that there's nothing that I as an individual can possibly do to change it. It's kind of a mindset of resignation that in some sense is almost pleasant because it relieves you of the obligation to act. And yet there's so many examples throughout history of really ordinary people, powerless, ordinary, unremarkable people, engaging in similar acts of conscience, whether it's Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus and sparking this unbelievably significant civil rights movement, or a Tunisian street vendor setting himself on fire in protest of tyranny and sparking a regional conflagration against the world's most entrenched tyrants. I think the critical lesson that I know I've learned from working with Edward Snowden, that you see from so many of these other examples, is that any institution built by human beings, no matter how formidable or powerful it seems, can always be attacked and reformed and changed or even destroyed and replaced by even the most ordinary human beings, as long as the will and the conviction and the passion is there. And to me, that is a critical lesson to keep at the forefront of all of our minds all the time. So with that, I thank you all very much, and we'll now have this discussion.